The following recording was made on April the 3rd, 1976 for the Kentucky Oral History Commission by Mrs. Thelma Marshall. It concerns her remembrances and those of her ancestors about life in Marshall County.
I'm Thelma Heath Marshall, daughter of Vance and Nanny Heath, and a descendant of Hugh Heath, who lived in a little community called Ball Knob, just east of Birmingham. People started their education of Birmingham, Kentucky, and Lake of Hugh Heath by Kentucky Lake. Hugh Heath had 4 daughters, all born before 1900. All 4 became school teachers. I think it rather exciting that these were career women so long ago. Their oldest daughter, Floy, was a teacher in the community in 1894. It was then called the Lucas Holland School, named after the man who gave the land. Floy Heath is mentioned in the Lemons Marshall County history as teacher. Later, the school was called Ball Knob. I'm sure there are many relatives of this school group living in Marshall County or nearby. It was this, where I have a picture of it that was made in 1894, where she is the teacher. The other picture that I have of the Ball Knob School was made in 1900. The teacher is Annis Heath, sister of my father, and younger sister of Floy. I well remember my father Vance Heath saying his sister Annis made him go to school. My father Vance Heath, not being quite so studious as his sisters and just a strip of a boy, said every night he prayed for the schoolhouse to burn. Well, long before that, he got his wish. My grandmother Heath and these 2 young teachers passed away at an early age. Typhoid fever was rampant in those days. Nevertheless, Hugh Heath kept the family together and saw to it that his little daughters, Lyda and Reba, were educated. Reba received a scholarship, and they both became well-known teachers. They went to Oklahoma and taught the little Indian children on the reservation. When they returned from Oklahoma, Lyda taught school all over Marshall County, while Reba taught in Benton and Paducah and Hardin. They had what they called a reading room, a place at the right of the house under an apple tree with hammock and chairs. They scanned everything they could get their hands on. When one of their nieces applied for her first teaching job after getting her degree in education at the university, she received it immediately, partly because she was their niece. The Fayette County superintendent said Lyda and Reba were the best teachers he ever come in contact with. When Lyda married Reed Travis in her middle 30s, she threw all she had into this different kind of life. She raised flower bulbs by the bushel and made wild berry jelly, which she in turn swapped to large companies for what in that day were luxuries. She was the first in everything. Note how quickly she changed from Lyda, the sophisticated teacher, to Lyda, the farm woman. She had a bronco horse she named Fuzzy, which she rode into Birmingham or anywhere she wanted to go. I remember her saying I was dashing around on Fuzzy when I was going through the middle years. She had the first pressure cooker I ever saw or heard of. She was the first one I ever heard talk about vitamins, and at that time she called them vitamins. And we knew them as vitamins for so many years, but then we learned that the correct pronunciation was vitamins, and that was 50 years ago. And they knew about and tried cereal before it was even on the market. And she wrote for the Marshall Courier as long as I can remember. And when Lyda became a widow, her bravery and accomplishments were remarkable. She moved to Detroit and worked as a typist for 10 years. Later, she moved to Louisville, where she worked as a secretary. She also did freelance writing and substitute teaching. In 1971, when Calvert City celebrated its centennial, I was very surprised to see Lyda's picture along with 2 of Calvert City's prominent citizens. She had been a teacher there many years ago. She passed away in 1965. Then just last year, when Calvert City honored one of its very outstanding citizens again, I was surprised and felt it an honor her picture appeared in the special edition. We considered it most unusual when she received a Christmas greeting in 1962 from Gamal Adel Nasser, President of the Arab Republic. I doubt if many Marshall Countyans have had such an experience. Yes, I think it's a credit to Marshall County to have produced 4 daughters like these. In this year of the bicentennial, I think it should not go without notice there was a place in Marshall County called Ball Knob where so many people started their education. In fact, though many years later this was the first school I attended, as well as my parents and other relatives, this was where the boys gathered wood from the nearby forest for the pot-bellied stove. This is where there was no outside toilet, just the girls' woods on one side and the boys' woods on the other side. A girl was disgraced if she ventured into the boys' woods. When I went to school there, the children waited for the huckster wagon every Thursday with a sweaty penny clutched in their hand to buy a stick of candy. This is where the water supply was a cistern and all the children drank from a bucket and dipper. This is where the boys stole wads of gum wax stuck under the wood desk from the girls. Gum wax was a concoction of dried sap picked from a sweet gum tree that had been hacked for this purpose. Yes, Ball Knob to me was a place of enchantment. The shadowy woods where my dad Vance Heath made cross ties, the sunny pasture, a favorite strip of country road that led to my grandmother's house. At the foot of the high hill behind our house was a special place in my childhood because a few scrubby trees there yielded juicy red-cheeked pears that were a delight to eat in the pebbly brook creek bed it was, shaded by shumacs and wild honeysuckle. As I tramped barefoot on this dusty road, there were wild strawberries just ahead in a cove. My mother often gathered enough to make a tasty pudding. No flavor was quite like the wild ones. It was here some 50 years ago my mother taught me about the hummingbirds that darted from flower to flower, the vicious hawk that swept down and nabbed a helpless baby chick, then disappeared into the woods. She taught me to identify the stately milkweed, the dainty Queen Anne's lace, and almost every weed tree and flower. Although I moved away from this little community when I was 9 years old, my happy childhood years there were spent in adventure without realizing past failures or even danger. One year my parents raised 9 acres of tobacco by themselves. Then in the cool of the evening, my dad would sit on our front porch and strum his old guitar and sing. I'd sit there with him and listen to the whippoorwills sing their summer night call. I guess we were the only people in the community who would all pile on the horse-drawn wagon when it was too wet to work after a big rain and go fishing. Sometimes we would go down to Little Bear Creek and stay in the deep pools where the creek was barely flowing. Often we would all wade into the water at the lower end and scare the fish up into the seine. Sometimes the banks would be undercut by the current and we would creep softly along the bank flushing the fish. My grandpa called this hogging them. It was his wish to fry them on the bank, so grandmother would take long skillets, meal, grease, and salt. How satisfying this was, frying the fish we caught over an open fire under the shady trees. No birds sang like the ones that hung around the creek. Surely God placed them there to add to the jubilation of these occasions. Even at this early age, I was just a wee bit ashamed of our fishing expeditions. Or should I say ashamed for people to know about it? Little did I know 50 years later fishing would become one of the nation's favorite sports. Mind you, this was my mother's people who did all these things. My father's people were the more studious type. One of my happiest times was sorghum molasses making at Grandpa's. I would hang around the molasses mill where Grandpa and Grandmother were experts at this process. This was a family project. Each person did his job. One would feed the cane into the big horse-drawn rollers, while another kept wood to the fire under the huge pans containing cane juice. My grandparents stayed busy stirring the bubbly juice as it cooked. They would run it off, as they called it, from one pan to another at the right time. By the time it reached the third pan, a delicious foamy concoction they called skimmings was dipped off. Young and old stood around with a piece of cane and a dipper of skimmings, eating all they could hold. Sometimes we would toast this over the fire like a marshmallow. Although I admired my daddy's people very much, I liked to live like my mother's folks. Our house sat on the spot where the original log school had been in the 1800s. But before the log schoolhouse was built in the early 1800s, some people by the name of Mr. and Ms. John Gino lived on Ball Knob Hill. There among the blossoming dogwoods and wild underbrush of the frontier days, these Ginos adopted a little orphan girl of Dutch descent by the name of Mary Clubb. Who would have thought that in later years she would turn out to be my great-grandmother on my mother's side? This was in the days of midwives and mud-stacked chimneys. Not more than 200 yards away, in an old cemetery, Mr. and Ms. John Gino are buried. Recently, in keeping with the late interest in restoring old cemeteries, Otho Holland placed markers there for these people. About 1920, after the days of the two schoolhouses, my dad acquired the land and built a new house there. This was about a quarter of a mile from the newer Ball Knob School where I attended. We had a topless Model T Ford, and when something went wrong with this car, my parents simply tore the car down and fixed it. Although there were very few cars in the community, I felt a little embarrassed our car had no top. Harry Waller was going to teach my dad to drive when we first got this car, but Dad was so sure that he could drive. He got in our precious Model T and hopped off the high bank in front of our house and broke an axle. We got the wheel fixed, and every Sunday we would go to church in that Model T. We would have to stop several times and fill a radiator from a puddle beside the road. But I'd never thought that church-going in those days would mean so much to me in my later years. Finally, we ordered a top and some side curtains from a mail order company. Dad painted the car, and he and Mother put the new top on it. I never felt so proud of anything. This man, Vance McLean Heath, farmer, was the one who saw to it Mother and I got to go when the showboat pulled into Birmingham. We would be in the fields, and when the calliope would break loose on some rollicking tune, he would pick up his hoe and say, "Come on, we better go to the show." I surely won't ever forget the sound of that calliope in the cool of the evening 3 miles away. Then there was the one-ring circus that came to Birmingham. Dad would pull me out of school and see that I attended every day. The circus was there with the pink lemonade and strawberry ice cream. I really never realized we were heavily in debt. I thought we were well-to-do when Dad bought 4 second-hand solid tires for our Model T. This relieved the problem of tire patching as many as 3 times on one trip in hot weather. I knew most of the Heath relatives and in-laws were better off financially than we were. However, it was their delight to visit us with Mother's cherry preserves and homemade ice cream. The ice cream was strictly from the cow, so to speak, because Dad would go to the field and milk the cow in the middle of a hot afternoon. He would return with large beads of sweat all over his face, carrying that bucket of milk. Who knows, a drop or two of sweat could have dropped into the milk bucket. Then while Mother stirred up the fixings, he would get into the Model T with the solid tires and head for town to get a block of ice. One could buy a block of ice for a nickel. If the car tried to chug out, as it sometimes did, his favorite saying was, "If she dies, I'll tan her skin, and if she lives, I'll ride her again." Once when my well-to-do uncle was visiting, who had a much better car, he and Dad started to town for ice. My cousin and I were in the back seat. Dad hit a rough place in the road. Uncle's head hit our new top and like to have broken the wooden brace across the top. When we were alone, I asked my dad why he hit the chug hole in the road so hard, and he replied, "Your uncle shouldn't have been sitting up there like a basket of shucks." One soon learned to hold and brace themselves when Dad drove with his solid tires. He had many funny sayings, like we were as busy as a cranberry merchant and so on. One time a cousin asked me what memory stood out most concerning my dad. After a few moments' thought, I told her I didn't know unless it was him walking down the aisle of the Methodist church to take the sacrament. He was a steward in the church and once taught the men's class, but why shouldn't he have been? He had a shouting Methodist grandmother. Her name was Talitha Lynn Dees Heath, 18 and 33, 19 and 12. And she really is a person that makes me think of the scripture, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water, because her descendants are still active in the church and carrying on for the church. And I have an acre of land to this day on Kentucky Lake that was owned by her and her husband. I'm the fourth generation to own it. It's hard to believe that peaceful little town Birmingham is covered by Kentucky Lake now and has been for a number of years. Ball Knob is fast becoming a resort area, but the world is changing, moving all the time. People now ask my children if they know what their grandfather Nancy said when someone offered him a drink of whiskey. Then they tell them this story that seems to live on and on. After my dad refused to drink the whiskey, the fellow said, "Mr. Heath, don't you like whiskey?" My dad replied, "Yes." The fellow said, "Why don't you drink it then?" And Dad replied, "It makes me drunk." Now I would like to tell you the stories that have been handed down from Civil War days. My grandfather, Hugh Ashburn Heath, was only 14 years old when he saw the gunboats come steaming up the Tennessee River. He heard a man remark, "Going to a big battle." The next day he, his father, and a hired man were clearing land where Moore's Camp now stands. They heard the roar of guns, and the hired man said, "They're fighting." It almost stuns the imagination to think of the same territory that holds beautiful Kentucky Lake and the resort area on its shores was in 1863 in hearing distance of gunboats from the Civil War. My grandfather threw down his axe and ran crying to his father. He had been told that war meant blood, men falling off their horses to die on the ground. He couldn't imagine what glory there was in it, and the utter futility impressed him. Then another story is about Sam Davis, a relative of my grandmother Heath's. I understand she used to tearfully tell this sad story of her kinsman. He was 21 and was with Coleman's scouts under orders from General Bragg to carry information about civil installations around Nashville. He came home one night and on the way back was chased by a troop known as the Kansas Jayhawkers. He was riding one of his father's spirited black horses, and as he sped by his pursuers in the night, he slapped their horses in the face with his felt hat. He was captured near Pulaski, and the papers were found in his shoe. He was given a quick trial and he refused to tell who gave him the papers. He was hanged. His parents heard by grapevine that a scout had been hanged, and fearful it was their son Sam, they sent their 11-year-old Oscar with a neighbor named John C. Kennedy to Pulaski. Mr. Kennedy learned from the saddened Federal general that it was Sam Davis. They had his body exhumed and brought back to Smyrna, where his father buried it in a rose garden. The third reminiscence concerns my two great-grandfathers, M.E. Heath and M.E. Stone, their horses, and the guerrillas. M.E. Heath was a big landowner and timber dealer and was known as one of the cleverest businessmen in the lower valley. Shortly after the war, thieves known as guerrillas roamed the countryside, stealing horses. Word came that they were coming to Birmingham. When they reached the Heath place high on the hill, they found the horses in the stable. They selected the best one and rode away, while M.E. Heath and his son Hugh looked on. But what did M.E. Stone, the farmer, do? When he heard the thieves were coming, he took hair from the horses' tails, tied it around the hock, thus crippling the horses. What use would a thief have for a crippled horse? They left them unmolested. The owner removed the hairs as soon as they were gone, and the horses were well the next day. The countryside